I wanted to look at how we could probably deal with literary studies and look at Nietzsche and use him from the angle of a theoretical concept. So I'm not going to really talk about the various works and things that Nietzsche has done, nor am I going to go back to his life or anything like that. But what I've done in the talk is I've taken a couple of things or points from his views, and I've used that to also try to give you certain kinds of textual readings that could be possible. Of course, the textual readings are basically from the background of what I really know, and it's quite subjective. But I wanted you to understand that discourses of thinkers are always something that we can utilize to read various kinds of literary texts. So that's what I wanted to do, so that today morning your principal was making the statement that it should go beyond the seminar. How would it go beyond a seminar? Unless you know the pathways by which you could carry it. So that is what I wanted to connect you with, to give you that kind of a background. Before I just start, I just wanted you to tell me, the students especially, what are the points that you really know about Friedrich Nietzsche? Anything. I'm not asking you anything particular, but anything, whatever do you know or you have heard about him, what can you tell me? A couple of points that you could tell me. Anybody? Have you heard his name? Yes or no? Yes? I want a loud yes so that I know you're not sleeping. Yes? You have heard about him? Where? I have got you only two, three voices. Where the whole voice? Yes or no? Do you know Nietzsche? Heard about him? I want loud voices. Where are you? Please say yes. Yes? Yes, that's nice. So, I don't want you to sleep. That's the point. I know you're all at your lunch and you're back here and you might not want to sleep. You heard today lots of talking about the concept of time, about being, about the question of his talks about women, and then about perspective, about knowledge, all those. So I'll just be running through some. It's not essential that I need to complete my PowerPoint, because I know that you have something else that might start around 3:30. So I'll keep myself to around, let's say, about 45 minutes or so of the talk. If you have questions, we can raise that. And if I feel that I have overstepped the time, please let me know so that I can stop. It's not necessary that I have to run through everything. So the next slide, please. I start with this first thing. As I said, he has a discussion about reason and instinct. Most of the time, what I've done is I put the statement from Nietzsche there, which you can, just look at it. In one of the sections, this is a book that he has written called The Twilight of Idols and Antichrist. This particular work came out after his death. It was a posthumous work. And in this book, there is one section that is called The Problem of Socrates. And one of the points that Nietzsche makes about Socrates is that he says that Socrates is corrupting the mankind because he's teaching them the idea of rationality and reason. And Nietzsche feels this is not very good, because what happens is that this is a construct. That when we talk about something like reason, it's a construct because we are made to think that we all have reason and that we are able to follow what is there in terms of a particular process. So Nietzsche comes up with the idea that to a certain extent he felt that basically human beings are instinctual. Let's say that you are taken towards something like fire, and you don't reason at that moment. If the fire is right next to you and you are standing right next to it, it's instinctual, you just move towards the side. Similarly, if you know that there is a rose bush and you're trying to pluck the rose bush, You are very clear that there's a thorn, you don't put your hand there. That's not reason, because that's actually your instinct. The minute it pricks you, you immediately either put your hand into your mouth to stop the blood. That's instinct. So, in a way, Nietzsche starts talking to you about the fact that man is basically having instincts rather than reason, and reason is something that gets constructed through a process. So Nietzsche is of the opinion that we need to work on our instincts, and we. It's not that he's trying to say that should not have reason, but basically his point throughout his works, almost all the works. Today morning when I was giving the felicitation, I was trying to tell you about this. Was that he was trying to critically examine the way we live and the way we are going through our life processes, and the concepts that are somehow framing us in the life that we are leading. So it was a questioning, I would say, rather than saying that you go back to this form or something. He was trying to question us about this notion of having instincts and reason. And this particular point I wanted to explain by using a text like Bronte's Wuthering Heights. If most of you have read that, so I took a familiar text that you knew. And if you knew Wuthering Heights, to a large extent, a large part of the whole story there that happens is based on instincts. It's not based on reason. So if you remember in the storyline, the notion of Heathcliff and his way of life, which is connected, or you are looking at the whole notion of something that is vengeance and revenge, goes in a different direction simply because there's a very, very instinctual matter by which Heathcliff and Catherine actually enact out their lives, because they are continuously working towards the notion of how instinct is more important than reason. And Bronte wanted to bring this, both the Brontes, in fact, even the other Bronte who writes Jane Eyre, they brought it simply because they wanted to examine or construct this notion, because they had connected reason with masculinity and they wanted to break that at a certain point. So you see that when we look at Nietzsche and we look at a text like the Bronte's work, we find that to some extent we can utilize the concept and start reading it from that angle. So this is one of the ideas that I thought you should be looking at, which comes from his text again. Please, the next slide. Then there was this talk about morality, which we have again heard in the morning. The idea is that in Beyond Good and Evil, he talks about two different moralities. One is the morality, and the other is the slave morality. Now, what he tries to talk again is that he talks about the idea that the master morality is one that values power and independence. It is also one that emphasizes that the slave morality, which is generally constructed as a herd morality, is something that is subordinate. So the master narrative or the master morality that is he's been talking about is basically a concept where he wants to look at the idea that the master morality makes up or constructs a particular idea about what is good, what is noble, and all that is connected to power. So, the slave morality, that is the people who come under the notion of being subordinates, they emphasize kindness, sympathy. They might also want to, gain over the masters, but they are unable to. But among them, they respect something like humility, sympathy, and the masters look down on that, because that morality, according to them, is a herd morality, which is part of a construction that belongs to the larger mass, where the master morality is not part of it. So he brings in this concept. Can we have the next slide? And so he talks about the fact that the concept of good comes from this distinguishing factor that determines the order of the rank. So the order of the rank is basically the noble rank, and then, as I said, one that is the slave rank. So the cowardly, the timid, the insignificant, all of them are dismissed in our social structure because we think that they are all beneath us. We don't need to want to give any respect. Now, what you should understand here is that there is a distinction he makes between the notion of power and how the notion of power can create a credibility for what could be the morality that comes from the master class. So you think that being powerful, being probably even an evil thing like arrogance, we assume that it is good. So we assume because we are thinking that they are the masters and it doesn't matter, we can do that. And what happens is many times when you talk about simple, nice things like kindness or benevolence, you don't give respect to it simply because it's not something that you want to give regard to. So he brings in this. This is a very important and a very distinctive kind of notion because he is now connecting morality with power. And he's making you understand that power is something that creates the concept of what you look at as morality. Can we have the next one? And then you see, he talks about the slave morality. He says that supposing that the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, the weary, and those uncertain of themselves should moralize, what will be the common element in their moral estimate? So the slave actually thinks that the virtues that he has are the powerful one. But the problem is that the society doesn't recognize that. So there is a fact that by which the herd or the group that is thinking, that is suffering, wants to create a notion that they have a morality, but nobody is going to pay attention to that morality. So, in a certain kind of way, this is also the fact that he makes this point, which I put in bold, that slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. So, based on the utility or the value at that particular point, the herd is going to create, or the slave morality is going to create chances by which it is going to appropriate somewhere the master morality. So the master morality is appropriated by the slave morality or the herd because it's going to become useful for them to change the construct from being the herd to becoming the noble. And this is something that is interesting. Again, if you want to look at it from the literary viewpoint, I've given you two works. One is Arvind Adiga's The White Tiger, and then the other is Vikram Chandra's Sacred Caves. I'll use only one text because I don't think I'll have time to take both the texts. In Arvind Adiga's The White Tiger, actually it has been dismissed as a really despicable novel by many people. And the reason is that it is despicable because there is an aspect that through crime, the protagonist climbs to become an entrepreneur. But this is precisely what is the difference. That is, if you are looking at it from the point or the angle of Nietzsche, he comes from the herd. He comes from the slave morality. And then he uses that to build himself. And the minute he becomes an entrepreneur, he actually adopts this sense of becoming powerful. And he deliberates on the idea of how he's going to be an entrepreneur and how he's going to run his taxi industry. And he also, because he has the power of economy, there is nobody who can even touch him, even though he has committed a crime. So you see that there is a large amount of this discussion that happens. And Sacred Games, similarly, is actually, if any of you have read it, you will know that it's a story read in the Bombay mafia crowd. And it's about corruption. And the lone man who's fighting for it is a man called as Sartaj, who's a police officer. But by the time the whole thing ends, he finds that it is better to acknowledge the mafia rather than participate in being a policeman and taking the road towards success by being an honorable policeman. It's not that he's really, bothered with the question of his role as a policeman. He's bothered with the question of morality in the whole story because he wonders, being a policeman, is that more moral, or is it better to be a mafia helping a large number of people and being that kind of a person? And so at the end of the story, even though he goes as a policeman, he allows the mafia leader to have his say. And these are very different kinds of works because they're not talking to you about the usual ideals in literature. They're trying to break the ideals in literature and discuss notions that might be very different. So this is another example for you. As I said, you can replace the examples, you can rework on the trends by which you want to read through the text. Can I have the next one? Morning there was a talk about perspectivism, and this particular background is with regard to what we call as perspectives. Now, Nietzsche talks about the fact that there is a perspectival knowing, or it affects us because we have a perspective in mind. Whenever we look at something, immediately our reason has made us think about a particular perspective. But Nietzsche is also of the opinion that actually why we have a perspective is because we have some inbuilt knowledge. But he says, from where does this inbuilt knowledge come into us? It has come because of the construct in which we are living. And we have understood that this is right or wrong, or this is the perspective we need to take, or this is the way we have to look at it. But he says that, as you can see here, he says that the word knowing, knowledge, has any meaning. The word is knowable, but it is interpretable, otherwise it has no meaning behind it, but countless meanings. So you keep, interpreting. So let's say that, like morning, you had this idea of the circle and the time that was given to you there. Now, some of you, because the speaker was telling you that it is a concept of time, you took that. But why can't we read it in other ways? Based on your knowing about the circle and the points that are there, you can read umpteen things into it. You don't really have to read it as being the idea of circular time. And why did you do that? Because one, of course, the speaker told you that. Second is because he was discussing about time. Even if he had not put that thing about telling you about time, you might have read it. So you see, what has happened is your perspective has been encountered by the background at which it has been given to you. So we can have a perspective. Let's say that, I just asked you, for example, to look at the board this side, which doesn't have anything written there. And I asked you to give your perspective about it. You might give me different perspectives about the panel there. It's not necessary that you'll give me only one. Why? Because at this point, you're not working with knowledge. You're working with your internal knowledge that you have. And you're working with the perspective you have. So you see that what happens is that you look at this discourse of whatever is perspective built in us, basically because we have impressions, we have ideas, we have knowledge by which we start looking at things. So perspective actually builds for us a sense that things, we think that it is something that should be objective. But again, Nietzsche makes this point that what is objective actually? Because when you say you are, being objective, you're trying to say again that you're being rationalistic. You're also taking the path that it is scientific. But then who's created all that? It is you, isn't it? You have created it. It is not that, there is anything like trying to say that there is a reason or a rationality. You have created it because you want to look at the word objective in that sense. But all interpretations, according to Nietzsche, somewhere along the line become subjective. Whatever stance you take, according to him, it becomes subjective. Because you cannot escape yourself. You're all the time having you within you. And I know, as I said, these are all things that are a little beyond our normal knowledge. So it's a bit difficult for many of us to understand it. But don't really bother about it. Just think for a second that, why shouldn't you question everything that is around you? Because when you question, when you critique, when you say the why of something, then you might lead to having better understanding of things around you rather than just taking a stance, all right, this is what it is. So his problem is basically with the idea of questioning things. And as I said, you see, one of the very important works that comes from the background is the work that I put in there by Raja Rao called The Serpent and the Rope. I wanted to use this because the serpent and the rope was an idea about using the Hindu philosophical background about what we call as Maya and illusion and reality. And to a certain extent in the work, Raja Rao builds up from the Upanishads. The book is basically from the Upanishads. And he talks about this idea of what it means to be a Hindu and his marriage to a French woman and the problematics of how his life is in a certain kind of way perplexing for him because he has a large number of perspectives that keep propping up into his mind. He wonders whether, his life with the French woman is actually a reality or is it an illusion. And he says that, the serpent, let's say that the serpent is one of the statements. I did not use the quote here, but one of the statements he makes in that particular novel is that, let's say, that in the middle of the night you get up and the rope is lying there right next to your bed. You don't know there's a rope. You just get up and suddenly you think it's a serpent. But let's say you put on the light. You recognize that it's not the serpent, it's the rope. So this comes because of the perspective. So what we are trying to look at is that perspectives is subjective to the particular context or their time or whatever it is that you're doing, and it comes from within you. It doesn't come from anywhere else. So this is again one more concept that Nietzsche talks about. I hope you're following. Do you follow me or is it too difficult for you? No? All right. So let's look at the next point that he's trying to make. Can I have the next slide? His views on God. This one that has become the most famous one. He says God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now everybody thinks that Nietzsche is against God. It's not that he's against God. His problem, you should remember, he comes from the background of the time then when the Enlightenment was there. He is actually questioning this notion of what you call of as God. And you should also remember which morning you were not able to get this, but one of the points is also that Nietzsche was not somebody who was only rooted in Western philosophy. He had been influenced quite a bit by Buddhist philosophy, by the Hindu philosophy. He had done readings. He had in fact read the whole of the Manu treatise. So it's not that he was just a lone figure talking to you from the Western angle. So somewhere along the line, he must have recognized that we have this whole idea, and that's also the later work of his, which came out posthumously, called the Antichrist. Because he thinks somewhere along the line, we have created a central point about God. And he thinks that we think that there is a God, so we work towards pleasing that God. We think that we need to have a value system where God is important. We think that we need to be moral because there is a God who is going to punish us if we are not there. So based on all that, we are going to work towards this construct of what is God. But Nietzsche also is of the feeling that somewhere along the line, sometime or the other, when we recognize this fact that God is only something that is there at the periphery, and you're just trying to build up on God, he thinks that God is only a construct to make us lead our lives in a particular way. And he thinks that God, at one point or the other, when we get very illuminated or when we become probably people who question our lives, we are going to maybe come to the idea that God is dead. So he is really not saying that God is already dead. He thinks that at some point we are going to come to that God is dead, that God remains dead, and we have killed him. That is the point that we are going to come to very soon. When that happens, what is going to happen to the cultural backdrop of the Western civilization? So, if you don't have God and you don't have a center figure to which you are going to adhere to, what is the way that you lead your life? He is also problematizing the fact that even being an atheist, somebody who is somebody who doesn't believe in God, even then there's a problem, because even the atheist who says that there is no God has said that because he is thinking that there is a God there. It's not that he is telling that there is no God, because he also knows that there is somewhere a God, so I'm going to protest against it, so I'm going to say there's no God. So we are constructing our world based on this one figurehead that is there. And we are thinking that God is the supreme being that is there. And we find a mechanism for value creation, a revaluation of values, as he puts it. We eventually descend into a world where recognizing our values are ultimately foundationless, meaningless. We will become apathetic and cynical. So when God disappears or when God is really dead, the world or the way in which you live, your civilizations, might become anarchic because you do not have a figurehead by which you create your value system. So we enter into a system where we become an empty figure or into emptiness or into a negativity because we don't have a construction at somewhere along the way. And this is not just something that comes only from Nietzsche. Because if you go back and read literary figures like William Blake, for example, or even Walt Whitman's poetry, there's a continuous substantiation where they do not want to adhere to God, but they want to look at the body, because the body of the human being itself, they think is something that is important. They also strike on the idea of total individualism simply because they think it's the individual who makes up everything in the world. So, in a certain kind of way, there's a deconstruction that Nietzsche does. He's not trying to say that, God is dead because I don't believe in him. He's trying to say that God is dead because somewhere along the line, when God dies, the value systems that we are constructing in our life will also go away. So, when that happens, what is the projection of your life? Because he is thinking that everything in which we live today or the life that we are leading is itself a construction. So how do we beat that construction? Somebody today asked about post-structuralism. This is the reason why Nietzsche becomes important, because he was the first person to actually start basically looking at how to beat against structures or how to remove structures from your lifestyle. And so that's also the reason why he becomes somebody who is unfathomable, because many times we are confused with the ideas that he tells, because he doesn't really come to any conclusions, he doesn't give you pathways, he cannot, simply because he is trying to give you a notion by which he is creating or trying to tell you don't believe in anything. Because if you are going to have beliefs, if you are going to have values, remember that everything is because in the society in which you are constructing. I'll come back to this point again a little later in my talk. Can we have the next slide, please? This part about the God, and when God is dead, we also enter into what could be nihilism. Nihilism is basically a question of emptiness in life, and this is also the root from which existentialist theory takes up its background. And in The Will to Power, one of his works, he says that why is it that nihilism is really necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence, because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. So if there is nothing, then from that you can build yourself. But again, he is ambiguous, because he also points out to you that when there is nothing, do you recognize emptiness? Do you recognize shunya? You don't, because you recognize emptiness because you know that there is something. So nothing comes from the idea that there is something also somewhere. So he is bothered with this idea of nihilism because he thinks that it creates for him necessarily also a sense of falseness, because there is simply no true world. And he brings in the concept of four big errors that he talks about in his thing, where he says that first one is the concerns, the confusion of cause and effect. The second is the error that addresses false causality. The third is the error of imaginary causes. And the final error concerns free will. Now, the point that he's trying to make today morning, again in the lecture, you had this question of cause and effect. Everything that you do in your life, you connect it to cause and effect. Let's say that you are sitting here in the seminar, here listening to me. The reason you're doing that is the cause is that I'm here speaking. If I had not been here speaking, you might not even be there. So there's a cause and effect that you are built upon. But also he says that this is a cause and an effect that has been created. It's a kind of a false causality. You have just created it because you want to create a meaning to your world. And what has happened in this process is that there is a sense of an imaginary cause that has come up in your life. And this has also led you to think of the final error that you're having free will. You have a free will whether you want to be part of this cause or not. But do you really have that much free will? You may not have, because you're part of an institution. You may are part of a particular concern of what is a seminar. You are part of a particular department. You are also, let's say morning I saw a lot of people signing in a book, which meant that their presence was accounted for here. So do you mean to say you have free will? So Nietzsche makes this point that everything that you do, whatever you call as cause and effect, is imaginary because you have created it. And in that process, what is free will somewhere gets lost. You follow? So he is trying to say that we may say that we have free will, but do we really have it as a question, because we are unable to process it in the social structure in which we are all placed. Okay, can we have the next one? We can move this, the next one. Yeah. So nihilism, according to him, has two different kinds of nihilism he talks about. The first is one that has got a spiritual vigor, and it is something that is powerful, which he calls as active nihilism, because it tries to build on the idea that the contingencies of your existence, you are questioning that there's a growth and power of a living condition that you're talking about. But he also talks in the will to part about a passive or a weary nihilism that comes, like, for example, from the Buddhist background, where you say that you pay obedience because you have come to a state that your spiritual strength has got into a state of weariness or fatigue. And so you just want to accept that something else is more valuable than that. But this, again, as I said, is a kind of concept that he has built about what is active and passive nihilism. You should also remember that you need not accept everything that a writer or a critic says. You can question, because how can you say that Buddhist or the nihilism of weariness is really in existence? Because if you go back to the Buddhist philosophy, and you go back to a poem like T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, that's also the pathway to regeneration. So you cannot just say that, that could be a weary passivism or a weary kind of nihilism and the other is more active. So you need to become a bit more problematic to question this kind of a mindset. All right, so then let's move to the next one. So we are looking at in the will to power this concept of understanding the human drives, and he says the final power to get rid of anything exists in us. It's the man who is important. And again today morning there was a talk about not having this idea about the women, but we should also remember in historical context for a number of years the human being was only recognized as a male. It was not, there was no distinction about a woman and a man. It could also be that concurrent that man included everyone else. So I'm not so sure whether, there was a distinction about the woman and the man as such that Nietzsche was trying to do. Let's not worry about that. But his point is that totally everything in the world is dependent on us, the individual. We have the background, and this is the philosophy of Sartre too, that we are in the life, we can create our life, but unfortunately we're not able to create because we have lots of links that create meaning to us in our own lives. So this point is something that Nietzsche again brings up, and again, as I said, the influence that comes for all existential thought about being and nothingness, about false consciousness, about free will, all that has come back basically because Nietzsche was discussing this. Can we just move to the next slide? So Nietzsche is trying to say that the will to power is the one that is more important, because he thinks that the will to truth is not the path, because truth according to them us is a concept. It's an abstract idea. But the will to power is there, and the will to power in all of us is good and bad. So we can create the good in us, or we can create the bad in us. And he prefers, he says that I've just given you two of his statements, that he says the scientist is in pursuit of truth because that is his will to power. The artist is in search of creative abilities because that is his will to power. So it's not that they are searching for truth. They are searching for the will to power themselves, or to build themselves and to becoming bigger and stronger. So he says that there is nothing like the will to power that itself is neither good nor bad. He prefers in some ways that it expresses itself to others. So people who look at it can construct it as being good or bad. Let's say a scientist is excessively in a laboratory in search of what he thinks is the pursuit of truth. Then, maybe his wife and family may say he's a bad person, he's neglecting the family. But people who are in science might say he's a good scientist because he's trying to create himself. So we are looking at this from the idea of the values that others are giving. He doesn't advocate, nobody advocates the pursuit of power, because he says that the sublimation of the will to power into creative activity or something is basically something that belongs within us. So we create the will to power, and in that, he thinks the strength of the humankind is there. So you should also remember that Nietzsche is giving a lot of rigor, a lot of value to the human being. He is not trying to say that the human being is a useless person. He is trying to say we have a lot of things within us, the self, the will, and the statement of individualism. We do not use it because we are continuously trying to program ourselves into societal structures. So one of the examples that I have for this will to power is the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Because if you remember in Huckleberry Finn, Finn goes through a very, very different kind of background, because he comes from a trash white background. He is made a ridicule and mockery of, but by the time the novel ends, he's also placed, in relationship to Tom, who comes from a better family. But by the time the novel ends, it is Huckleberry Finn who actually ends by saying that he's going to do more exploration. And that exploration is not about geographical territory, but about his own self. And if any of you remember the Mark Twain beginning, he says that this could all not be the truth, it could just be a lie. So, giving you the notion that the will to power is something that Huckleberry Finn builds up by his own self. All right, so then can we move to the next? This is a quotation from Huckleberry Finn. You don't need to really read it, but he does say that at one point that I know he when he's with Jim, he makes a statement that you can't pray a lie. I found that out. So you cannot really make a lie and say that I can use this lie to construct myself. He understands the notion of how lie is himself creating his selfhood. Can we go to the next slide? Then he comes to this notion of the overman. Who is this overman? He has two concepts, the overman and the last man. The overman is the one which comes from the will to power. If the will to power has worked, then there is a creation of the overman. So, what is the ape to man? A laughing stock or a painful embarrassment, and man shall be that to overman, a laughing stock or painful embarrassment. You have made your way from worm to man, and much in you is still worm. Once you were apes, and even now too man is more ape than any ape. The overman is the meaning of the earth. So the overman is somebody who becomes better than what is the background of being an earthen, or the man who comes from the earthly background. And when you understand the will to power in your own self, you actually grow to a bigger thing. And somewhere along the line, I think Nietzsche draws on this from the transcendental movement, because when the transcendental movement talks about this whole notion of an overview that is there somewhere far beyond our consciousness, and that you continuously have to strive to get that overview from, or the oversoul, they are talking about a very similar thing. And this is also participating in many other philosophical traditions. It's not just the Christian doctrines. So he brings this point about the overman who can overcome or who can struggle to create that will to power to such an extent that he becomes an overman. Can we have the next slide? But there's also the fact that there's a last man. Because he says, the time of the most despicable man is coming. He that no longer able to despise himself, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, because he cannot even understand what could be love or what could be, the ideas of the human itself. So when you don't understand humaneness in some way by Nietzsche, that's what Nietzsche says, that man becomes the last man. So you create this, and of course, again, this is a very ambiguous statement that he's trying to make, because this is a construction that he does, trying to tell you that there's an overman and that there's a last man. Personally, I think that somewhere along the line, if you have the will to power and you are struggling for it, even the last man could, to a certain extent, get onto the first step of being the overman. So I don't know whether the last man really can exist in the way he's talking, because then you are creating the idea that the last man is like an animal who doesn't have any sense of being human. But one of the examples again I've given you is Steinbeck's of Mice and Men. And if you remember there are two people, one who is quite active and one who has got the ability to think, and the other is a huge muscular man who gets into problems. And within the two friends, when the man who is very strong, right now, I forget the name of the characters, even though I've read the book. One is Lenny, I remember. I don't remember the other name. So, when that particular brutal forced man does an act because of his stupidity or dullness and he kills, then we can construct this idea of the overman and the last man utilizing that concept in the book. But as I said, it's also a problematic feature because the last man you are trying to say is only animalistic in nature. All right, can we move to the next slide? So, what I'm trying to say, this is almost the last slide. What I'm trying to tell you is that this is from Nietzsche's Human All Too Human. I'll read this one quote for you, that all philosophers have the common failing of starting out from man as he is now and thinking they can reach their goal through an analysis of him. They involuntarily think of man as an eterna veritas, as something that remains constant in the midst of all flux, as a sure measure of things. Everything that the philosopher has declared about man is, however, at bottom, no more than a testimony as to the man of a very limited period of time. Lack of historical sense is the family failing of all philosophers. What is needed from now on is historical philosophizing and with it the virtue of modesty. So he believes in this because he thinks that man is continuously changing himself based on the historical context in which he is. That is also the reason that just now today morning we had this discussion that the now of mine is different from the now of all others, because the context in which all of you come, the experiences from which you come, the backgrounds from which you come, makes your now so different from the now that I am. So, in certain ways, finally, this is what I want to talk to you about Nietzsche. What I wanted you to understand, even though I gave you many concepts, I gave you literary trends. Finally, what I wanted you to make yourself think is that keep thinking. Because if you don't think, you don't keep asking questions, you don't keep understanding why you are here, why you are doing this, what is the reason for you to do this, what is the necessity of reading this, then you will never try to evolve, because knowledge comes from that background. So that is the most essential thing that you need to discuss. And of course, the last one. Can we just move? So thank you. And if you have questions, I'm really ready to take them. Thank you very much for your time.